welcome everyone to yet another video in the classical conditioning series talking about stages and processes in classical conditioning. Before we move any further with today's video, in order to understand the concepts that we discuss in today's video, it is absolutely crucial for you to have a good grasp over the concept of classical conditioning and that you're able to answer the question, what is classical conditioning? To help you in this endeavor, we have a video exactly discussing this topic on our channel. You can find this video by clicking on the link in the description box below, and it will also be pinned to the comment section, or click the I button on the top right corner of your screen. If you are already familiar with this topic, then you can go further, but if not, we highly recommend you looking at that video before you go any further with the current video. Right, so having said that, let's move on to looking at what we cover for today's video. So we talk about 5 general stages or processes in classical conditioning. The first aspect that we discuss pertains to studying about the concept of acquisition. We then move on to learning about extinction. Then we learn about spontaneous recovery. Following that, we look at the concept of stimulus generalization, and finally look at the concept of stimulus discrimination. So without further ado, let's start by learning about acquisition. So acquisition is the initial learning period when we are acquiring the associations between the neutral and the unconditioned stimulus. So this is the process that occurs during the repeated presentation of the neutral and the unconditioned stimulus during the conditioning phase, which allows us to acquire and develop the associations between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Now, following this process or stage of acquisition, we observe that the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and it elicits the same response as it would have to the original unconditioned stimulus. So it just means that you don't need the unconditioned stimulus anymore to elicit the response. You only need the conditioned stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov's experiment, we can expect that when the dog salivate at the sound of the bell, acquisition of stimulus-response mapping has occurred. Graphically, we can plot this acquisition process as presented here on this graph, as shown here, with increasing strength of the conditioned stimulus, which occurs during the conditioning process that we just saw before. The stimulus-response mapping between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus tends to increase over time. Now, 3 different factors crucially impact the acquisition process. They are as follows. The first pertains to stimulus salience, the second pertains to stimulus order, and the final one pertains to the time between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus presentation. Let's look at each of these factors in a little more detail and understand how they impact the acquisition process. Let's first look at stimulus salience. Now, in order for acquisition to occur successfully, we have to use a clearly discernible salient stimuli. For example, if Pavlov used a bell which produced very low, faint sounds, then it would be so difficult for the dogs to acquire the stimulus-response mapping, and it is thus possible that the conditioning would not occur. Replacing this with a bell which has a discernible sound will be more salient, thereby facilitating the acquisition of the mapping between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and the conditioning process would thereby take place, resulting in producing a conditioned response. Moving on, let's look at the concept of stimulus order and how it impacts acquisition. Now, the order in which you present the stimulus is very important for successful acquisition as well. You must present the neutral stimulus before the unconditioned stimulus in order for the animal to acquire and learn the mapping between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, as it is this order that allows the neutral stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus, in future leading to eliciting the conditioned response. If you reverse this order by presenting the unconditioned stimulus before the neutral stimulus, then the animal will never learn to acquire the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus pairing. In this stimulus order, the dog will not produce any response to the bell because it is still just a neutral stimulus. When the stimulus is presented crucially impacts the process of acquisition. For example, you start the experiment and present the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus in trial 1, and then after a very brief time period, present the next trial and continue doing this repeatedly during the conditioning process. Presenting the next trial in immediate succession will lead to successful acquisition because the animal, in this case, will be able to relate the events occurring well. On the other hand, having a longer time delay makes it difficult for the animal to establish the relationship between the events. So, if the next trial is presented at a much longer delay, then there will be no acquisition of the stimulus-response mappings between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, which will result in no conditioning taking place. Another type of time delay could be presenting the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus at a larger time gap. This also impacts acquisition because the animal is unable to establish a relationship between the occurrence of the two events, thereby leading to a lack of conditioning. Let's now move on to understanding the concept of extinction. Extinction is the second phase or process in classical conditioning, and it is characterized by a state in which there is a decrease in the conditioned response when the originally conditioned stimulus is presented alone for a long duration without the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus till the point that the animal essentially makes no response to the conditioned stimulus. In such a case, the conditioned stimulus returns back to its original neutral stimulus state. This is also referred to as extinction conditioning. Graphically, we can plot this as a declining phase trend as shown here in this graph. We can observe in this graph that not presenting the unconditioned stimulus following the conditioned stimulus, that is, presenting the conditioned stimulus alone, weakens the strength of the conditioned stimulus over time, which is what results in the extinction of the conditioned response. Let's now move on to understanding the concept of spontaneous recovery. Now, spontaneous recovery is the third phase of classical conditioning in which there is a spontaneous and sudden increase in the response to the conditioned stimulus following a period of pause or break after the extinction has occurred. What happens is that although at the end of the extinction conditioning, the conditioned response disappears, the effects of conditioning does not disappear completely, because of which the spontaneous recovery phenomena is observed. Pavlov found that while during the extinction phase the dogs did not salivate to the sound of the bell, after a break or a pause or a rest period, the sound of the bell again elicited the salivation, thereby demonstrating the spontaneous recovery phenomenon. Graphically, this can be plotted as shown here in this graph. We can see that following the pause, there is a spontaneous recovery of the conditioned response as shown here by the arrow. The occurrence of spontaneous recovery shows that extinction conditioning does not lead to unlearning the stimulus-response mappings we learn during the conditioning process. However, note that the conditioned response elicited in the spontaneous recovery phase is lesser in extent as compared to the conditioned response that we observe in the acquisition phase as plotted here. In other words, the conditioned response does not return to its full strength in the spontaneous recovery phase. In fact, we observed that multiple cycles of extinction recovery can further decrease the strength of the conditioned response observed in the recovery phase. So, the strength with which we observe the conditioned response in the acquisition phase does not return in its full strength in the spontaneous recovery. Now, in a future video, we will dive deeper into the topic of spontaneous recovery and try to answer why the conditioned response is lesser in its strength during the spontaneous recovery phase and what causes spontaneous recovery as well. However, in this video, we focused on learning what spontaneous recovery is. Now, having learned that, let's move on to the next topic, which is stimulus generalization. So, in stimulus generalization, as in the name, the animal learns to generalize their conditioned responses across different stimulus, which is closely resembling the original conditioned stimulus but is not the original conditioned stimulus. Let's understand this with an example. Say, if the sound of the bell used to condition the dogs closely resembles to the sound of, say, a xylophone, then based on the concept of stimulus generalization, we should observe the dog salivate to the sound of xylophone alone, although there hasn't been any deliberate conditioning of the dogs with the xylophone. This is the concept of stimulus generalization. Moving on, let's now understand the concept of stimulus discrimination, which is just the opposite of stimulus generalization. Now, under stimulus discrimination phenomena, the animal can clearly distinguish between the conditioned stimulus from any other stimulus that they have not been conditioned to. This allows them to restrict their conditioned responses to only the conditioned stimulus and not elicit them to any other neutral stimulus. Let's look at an example. For example, the sound of the bell to which the dog is conditioned might not match the sound of, say, a piano or a Casio. In such a situation, the animal can discriminate between the stimulus and selectively elicit the conditioned response only to the sound of the bell, but not to the sound of the piano. Alright, let's summarize the processes or stages in classical conditioning that we covered in today's video. We first covered the concept of acquisition. Acquisition is the initial period of learning that helps us form the stimulus response mappings between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. We then learned about the concept of extinction, which is the period that extincts the expression of the conditioned response due to presenting the conditioned stimulus alone for a long period of time. We then moved on to understanding the concept of spontaneous recovery, which is the rapid recovery of a previously conditioned response following a break period after the extinction. We then moved on to understanding the concept of stimulus generalization, and we saw that it essentially means eliciting the same conditioned response to another stimuli that resembles the conditioned stimulus but is not the conditioned stimulus. And finally, we learned about the concept of stimulus discrimination, which is just the opposite of stimulus generalization, wherein the animal can discriminate the conditioned stimulus from the other stimulus that does not resemble the conditioned stimulus, thereby eliciting the conditioned response only exclusively to the conditioned stimulus alone. Right, so that was the end of today's video. Thank you for watching. If today's video was helpful, then please don't forget to subscribe to Brain Cyclopedia. Also make sure to like, share and comment on this video. Do make sure to press the bell icon as well for updates on our upcoming new videos, and also make sure to connect with us on all of our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. You can find the link of these platforms both on the channel banner, and also the links are in the description below and pinned to the comment section. See you in our next video.